So as we've been working our way through the minor prophets, the book of the 12 as it's indicated in the Hebrew Bible, we're now on the fourth book, the book of Obadiah. We've been using this table to help kind of frame some things. One of the important things to note about the minor prophets are the ones not marked out here, is you have a different audience for whom the prophet speaks, and then you also have different time frames. Most are speaking before the exile, either when the Assyrians take the northern kingdom, or when the Babylonians take the southern kingdom. But some are post-exile. Since we're looking at Obadiah today, we see that he's pre-exile, and interestingly, his prophecy is against Edom. In general, the prophets tend to speak to Israel or Judah, the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, and they'll throw in tidbits to other places. But here we have one specifically aimed at Edom. I've used this before, so just to flash through again, the minor prophets are part of the book of the 12 in the Hebrew Bible. I've also been using this timeline, which is really helpful to me to kind of see where to place the different minor prophets. But this indicates that Obadiah is difficult to date. And the big reason for that is, well, first of all, he doesn't mention that he's speaking during a certain time period when certain kings were in Israel or kings were in Judah. That always helps us to date things. So he doesn't tell us specifically when. And then secondly, there are a couple of times historically we could see that there would be an oracle against Edom. We'll talk more about what Edom is in just a second, but I want to note that if you look in the commentaries, there are two big time periods that Obadiah is assumed to have written in neither one or the other. The earlier one is actually a story that's recounted in 2 Kings chapter 8. And so just quickly we'll read that. In the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, when Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, began his reign as king of Judah. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for he married a daughter of Ahab. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so he's not a good king. Nevertheless, for the sake of his servant David, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah. He had promised to maintain a lamp for David and his descendants forever. In the time of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up its own king. So Jehoram went to Zair, that's the mountains of Seir, which is important for identifying Edom, with all his chariots. The Edomites surrounded him and his chariot commanders, but he rose up and broke through by night. His army, however, fled back home. To this day, Edom has been in rebellion against Judah. Libnah revolted at the same time. So you see, here's a story of Edom and its revolt and its backstabbing against the nation of Israel. But probably this isn't the time period that we're talking about. Probably it's a later time period when Obadiah is talking about the fact that Edom betrays Judah, the southern kingdom, when the Babylonians come through. So, now I know my chart here says, that the southern kingdom falls in 585. So usually we date the fall of the southern kingdom around 587, 586 BC, somewhere in there. And so if that's the case, then we would be putting Obadiah probably closer to that happening, because he sees that Edom is about to betray Israel. And remember, when prophets speak, sometimes they speak of the past as if it's present, and sometimes they speak of the future as if it's already happened. So it can be difficult just to go by tense. If he says something will happen, it might have already happened. And if he says something happened, it might only be going to happen. That kind of thing. For reference, again, we use a lot of maps in this class. The southern kingdom of Israel and the northern kingdom of Judah. But important for our purposes today is the fact that Edom is here to the south of Judah. Notice, they are situated cheek to jowl, right there. They occupy a lot of the same space, and so it's not surprising that Edom would have and Judah are related. In fact, by the time you get to the New Testament, Edom still matters in some ways. By this time, it's called Idumea, and it's a Roman province. When Herod the Great was the ruler, he ruled all of Israel all the way north of Israel and all the way south down into the historic Edom or Idumea. And so Edom would be in this general area. And then historically, it's hard to make boundaries because they're never terribly fixed. But worth noting about Herod is that Herod turns over his kingdom to his 4 sons, and they are, one is put over the region of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. Now this is by New Testament times, or close to New Testament times, I should say. After our point in Obadiah. I just want to point out to you that Idumea factors in. So Edom is still there in some way, but now it's again subservient to Judea, which is subservient to Rome. Let me note this too. Herod the Great, one of the several Herods that are mentioned in the New Testament, is the Herod when Jesus is born. He's the one that rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. And so Herod, on the one hand, would be seen as a good Jew. In many ways, he lived like a good Jew. On the other hand, the people never really accepted him as some kind of Jewish king because he was an Edomite, or his people were historically from Idumea. And in fact, his whole dynasty had been put in place by rulers of Israel during the time of the Maccabean revolt. So this is the time between the Old Testament and New Testament. And Herod's folks converted to Judaism, and they have all the power. So when Herod takes over, he is on the one hand a Jew, but on the other hand not really seen by most of the Jewish people as being legitimately a Jew. So when you read the historical sources, they're going to treat him mostly like a Gentile, although he himself clearly thought of himself as a Jew. Okay, so it's one of those, things historically. It's hard to nail some things down, and one is: would you say that Herod's a Jew? Well, sociologically, pretty much, right? But practically, well, there are certain things about him you'd say, well, he doesn't qualify for this reason or that reason. So anyway, it's part of the fun of history, but also the debate that takes place. So I'm mentioning all that just because Edom continues to factor in some way. Now, to really understand Edom, though, you got to go all the way back to Jacob and Esau. So, of course, when Jacob and Esau are born, twin brothers, Genesis 25 says, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So this talks about Rebekah giving birth to these 2 boys, to these 2 nations. And there's a really interesting kind of play on words going on here. So Esau is covered with red hair when he's born. Red and Esau go together. So later on in Genesis 25, you remember the story where he loses his birthright? So it says in Genesis 25:30, he, that's Esau, said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. All right, so he's been out hunting all day, and he's starving so much he's willing to give up his birthright over just a little bit of stew. Now, red stew, probably a good translation. All of them say something like red stew, red pottage, something like that. Literally, it's red. Give me some of that red, he says. Ha-adom. Edom. Give me some of that Edom. And that's why he's called Edom. Now, you would think he would be called Edom because Edom means red. You'd think he would be called red because he had red hair. But at least he was also called Edom because he gave up his birthright just for some red soup one day. He was that rash, and he was, ruled by his own passions. Anyway, so Esau, of course, he loses his birthright, he loses the blessing, and Jacob is the one who ultimately inherits all the promises that God has. So Esau is on the outs, and we know he forms his own people there south of Israel. Interestingly enough, the story of Israel is told in several stages. And so you got God telling Abraham that his descendants will eventually be numerous and they'll have a land and all this kind of stuff. But that takes a long time to actually happen. Edom becomes a nation before Israel really does. It's a really fascinating thing. So when you're reading in Genesis, you can read about Edom as if it's already a thing. And by the time that the Israelites are going out of the desert, their desert wanderings to try to enter the promised land, Edom is already there. In fact, they have to try to negotiate passage with Edom. So they have a long history. Now, Edom there is a mountainous region south of Israel, and the mountains have a red hue to them. So that's why they're called Edom, red. And let's see. You got to remember, whenever we talk about Edomites, that they're a special category of people that, on the one hand, are despised by the Jews, but on the other hand, are brothers to the Jews. Right? Jacob and Esau are brothers. And so there's kind of a love-hate relationship going on. God told the Israelites in Deuteronomy 23, do not despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you, literally are your brothers. Do not despise an Egyptian because you resided as foreigners in their country. So the Edomites were these kind of special people. They had a special relationship. And guess what? Esau worshipped that God. Esau worshipped the God of his father. That doesn't mean that the Edomites worshipped as the Jews did, but it does mean that they had some history of worshiping the God of Israel, that they had some notion of that God. So they would have had a complicated relationship with Israel because it had been like Israel, but not a lot like Israel. And certainly, geopolitically, they inhabited a lot of the same space and had a lot of the same competing interests, I should say. In Numbers 20, when you've got the people of Israel on their way to inhabit the promised land, they need to go through Edom, that southern, just south of what would be Israel. So Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom saying, this is what your brother Israel says. Notice, this is what your brother Israel says. We're generations later, but still, the Edomites are brothers to the Israelites. Now we are here at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your country. So we promise not to take anything. We just want to pass through. But Edom answered, you may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword. They said, no, really, we're not going to do anything wrong. We just want to pass through. Edom says, none shall pass. Edom absolutely views itself as not being a friend to Israel. So Edom oftentimes is an enemy of Israel in the Old Testament. So that leads us up to the vision of Obadiah. So Obadiah is, like I said, the shortest book in the Old Testament, and it's all about Edom and Edom's wrongdoing, probably foretelling when the Babylonians come in and take the Jews into exile and disperse the southern kingdom. The Edomites help out in this, and they look on, and they're willing accomplices in that. So let's start reading in Obadiah. So this is verse 1. The vision of Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, rise, let us go against her for battle. So notice, first thing, this is the vision, and the way that the book sets it up, it's different than most of the other prophets. Usually, a book will say something like, the word of the Lord came to so-and-so. That tells us this is when God says, you are now a prophet, and you have to speak for me. This actually takes place in the form of a vision, we're told. But still, it's prophetic in nature, and we know that because you've got the sovereign Lord speaking, so God is speaking through this vision, and he says it about Edom. So again, this is all about God's judgment on Edom. We've heard a message from the Lord. So this is definitely, Obadiah is definitely a prophet because he's offering a message from the Lord God of Israel. And it says an envoy was sent to the nations, or a messenger. Now this isn't the word that can be translated angel. It's not that. But still, it could be that it is. He's talking about an angelic messenger. And envision that the angel army is ready to rise up against Edom. And it says it was sent to the nations to say. Now I should stop just for a second and say, nations, historically, to a Jew, the nations are the Gentiles. In fact, what you'll see is one way to kind of get at the Edomites, for the Jews to say, you're not us, is to call them Gentiles. And to say Edomites and Gentiles, they're all the same thing. So they just use the words interchangeably. Even though they are related to the Jews in a special way, it's also true that they are ultimately the enemy of the Jews. So Edom in the Old Testament and the New Testament oftentimes represents Gentiles. Even when God promises to bring Edom back in or bring the Gentiles into his kingdom. But here it's all about judgment. So if this is an angel, doesn't have to be an angel, this messenger envoy is saying, rise, let us go against her for battle. So this is God's judgment on Edom. Verse 2. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. If thieves came to you, if robbers in the night, oh, what a disaster awaits you. Would they not steal only as much as they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave a few grapes? But how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. All your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set up a trap for you, but you will not detect it. So again, we just have a few short verses here, but there's a lot packed in there. So he says, you're going to make you small among the Gentiles or among the nations. So Edom always had its eye on being something bigger. It wanted to be one of the great empires like the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Egyptians. And at times, Edom did grow to a pretty large geographical area. So but he says, no, absolutely. Your time of any kind of power is over. So you're going to be small among the Gentiles. This is how he describes them. He says, you live in the clefts of the rocks. You live in those high places, and so you think you're so big and mighty. You think you can kind of stand over us and look at us and look down upon us. This is an interesting way, but to describe them, it tells us a little bit about how they lived in those mountains south of Judah. So it's clear that the area that the Edomites possessed changed from time to time, but we know that by the time the Romans came, they controlled a large area far south of them, all the way down into what's called the Negev. And one of the things you can see is that the stone there is really good for carving. So if you might have heard of the ancient city of Petra, which at one point in history would have been the same geographical area that the Edomites conquered. So it would have been part of Edom's territory at some point. Now I'm not trying to say that the Edomites carved out Petra, but I want you to see what's in Petra. Maybe some of you have been to Israel, maybe you have taken the journey down south to Petra, but this is often called the monastery. It's not a Christian monastery. Sometime around the 1st century was carved out of the mountain. And you can see around Petra that this is a great place that you can build an edifice out of the stone of the mountain. So what I'm envisioning is these people live up in these hills and they're able to carve out not necessarily all these intricate kind of things, maybe they did, but also they just have their holes that are strategically great for standing above and watching your enemy. And he says, so you stay up there and you laugh at us and you mock us. You think that you're like an eagle. And come on, let's be honest. What in the ancient world, what are you going to do to an eagle? Probably not much of anything unless you find its nest, right? Because it's always able to fly away. So you think that you're going to be okay. But he says, I will bring you down. So even if you live in your mountains, that doesn't mean I can't reach you, declares the Lord. So then he says, he uses a couple of ways to describe how people pillage things. So if a thief or a robber breaks in, usually they don't clean out the whole house, do they? I mean, they're only going to take a few things. That's the notion. Usually you can't, you don't pull up several U-Hauls and take everything in the house. I'm sure that does happen sometimes. But in general, they only take what they want. They're going after specific things. He said, and that would be good for you, Edom, if what was going to happen to you was just a matter of people coming in and taking some things. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be much worse than that. And secondly, he says, when the grape pickers come by and they pick the grapes, I mean, they're going to miss a few, right? There'll be a little bit left, and so, if you wanted to go by and eat a grape, you could do that. There'd be one or two left over. He said, but that's not the way it's going to be when judgment comes on Edom. It's all going to be brought down. There's not going to be anything worth that you could salvage from it. And so he says, notice he calls them Esau, by the way. Edom and Esau, always related. He said, you'll be ransacked, your hidden treasures pillaged. So I'm envisioning they live up in these holes in the mountains, able to kind of keep their things hidden away from everybody. But he says, look, we Israelites, or we Judahites, we look up there and we know you have treasures hidden in those holes. And they are going to be taken. They're going to be pillaged. So if the people in Judah are going to be judged, so also are the people in Edom. Now, I think it's a good point to stop and emphasize this. It's like our hearts are almost wired to want to always identify the good guys and the bad guys, right? I mean, that's the way the old Westerns worked, right? Who's the guy on the white horse? He's the guy always in the right, and the people in the black are always in the wrong. We like it when it works that way. One reason we like superhero movies, right? We like the good guys and the bad guys. A lot of times in the Bible, you've got different flavors of bad. And ultimately, that's what God says about Israel, about Judah, about Edom, about Assyria, about Babylon. So, it doesn't just suffice to say, well, we're God's people, so we're in the right. No, they tried that over and over again, and God said, don't assume that because you're called by my name that you escape judgment. And so the Edomites are being judged, but don't get me wrong, Judah gets judged too, and Israel gets judged. So the happy ending that you're wanting where, the good guys win and the bad guys lose, well, it doesn't work exactly that way. Instead, the good guy is always God. He's really the only ultimate good that you see. And it's going to be his good that ultimately wins, not necessarily a certain people group who are doing the right thing. Invariably, the people who do the right thing in one place and time do the wrong thing in another. The Bible also talks about people, here. So here we have centuries, many centuries, and I admit it, I don't know how to date the book, but it's going to be many centuries after Edom, after Esau and his separation from his brother. And yet, Israel still talks about Edom and Esau as if that happened yesterday. They still hold those grudges. So, biblically, it's as if, imagine this, we equated the English who fought at the Battle of Hastings, who were battling the French in 1066, with the same people who inhabited the American colonies. Now, that works in some way. There is some historical continuity, right? But on the other hand, that doesn't work at all for lots of reasons. And one reason is this. So back in 2005, we lived in Britain for a spell while I was working on a degree there. And I remember I was staying at this little kind of bed and breakfast place. I talked to the owner and I said something about him being British. And he said, well, I don't really think of myself as British. I think of myself as English. Okay. All right. Well, I didn't know that. All right. So then later, the preacher at our church was Scottish. And I remember saying something to him about being British. And he said, well, I don't really think of myself as British. I think of myself as Scottish. And I thought, okay. So in my mind, I know how we Americans do it. We say Britain, we say England, we mean all of it, right? I mean, we don't typically, that doesn't mean that doesn't matter at all historically. Just in our minds, we kind of group them all together. But they can tell you how there's a distinction. So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, to group people together like that doesn't really make historical sense. But on the other, when you're looking at it from God's perspective, when God's telling his story, he can trace certain peoples and certain sins throughout generations. And so that's what we're seeing. Esau is still being judged. even though Esau's been dead for hundreds and hundreds of years by this point, by his descendants. Okay, I just thought that was a worthwhile little sidestep. Now let's move on. This is a short book, right? So I got to find something to say. No, I'm kidding. I promise. So it says your allies will force you to the border and your friends will deceive and overpower you. So envision something like this. In times of war, look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. People move, right? And they're trying to get out of the way of the harm. And so immediately they're going to go as far away as they possibly can. So a lot of people in Ukraine are in Poland right now, or from Ukraine are in Poland right now, because the Polish have said, come in. What if the Polish were in league with the Russians, though? And said, yeah, come here. So everybody goes to their border, and then the Polish say, no, you can't come in. Or, even worse, they start to attack. So that when you thought your allies were there to save you from your enemy, instead, they begin to attack. So they'll force you to the border, your friends will deceive you and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you. So maybe even they've been exchanging goods with these people. They're eating your bread, and you think they're going to allow you to some protection. But no, they're just setting a trap for you. And he said, and you won't detect it. So this is all going to happen when you least expect it, when you're not ready for it. Now, one of the reasons that we want to date Obadiah to the time of the Babylonian exile is because it's got so many similarities with parts of Jeremiah, which more specifically was talking about the Judah being taken into Babylonian captivity. And one of the places you see that the most is in Jeremiah chapter 49. So keep in mind what we just read from Obadiah, and now read what Jeremiah says about Edom. Concerning Edom, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Is there no longer wisdom in Teman, which is one of the cities of Edom? Has counsel perished from the prudent? Has their wisdom decayed? Turn and flee, hide in deep caves, you who live in Dedan, also a city in Edom. For I will bring disaster on Esau at the time when I punish him. If grape pickers come to you, would they not leave a few grapes? If thieves came during the night, would they not steal only as much as they wanted? That sound familiar? Isn't that exactly what Obadiah said? But I will strip Esau bare, I will uncover his hiding places so that he cannot conceal himself. His armed men are destroyed and his allies and neighbors, so there's no one to say, leave your fatherless children, I will keep them alive. Your widows too can depend on me. So you've got like a mini Obadiah here in Jeremiah, in this one chapter, in his judgment on Edom there. So there seems to be a lot of similarity between what Jeremiah is saying and Obadiah is saying, so we want to date them together. Let's pick up now in verse 8. In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, those of understanding in the mountains of Esau? Your warriors, Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march to the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down the fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. So what did they do that was so wrong? It's clear that they did not lend a hand. And so the judgment is, first of all, it's clear that he's talking about a future time point. He says, in that day. Later he's going to talk about the day of the Lord. So I think he's referring here to the day of the Lord when Edom will ultimately have to give an answer. And he says, different way of describing the people of Edom. So the wise men of Edom, that Jeremiah also mentioned the wisdom of Edom. The mountains of Esau, Teman, which also was mentioned in Jeremiah, one of the chief cities of Edom. Esau's mountains are mentioned here again. So we're using all these different ways to say Edom and the destruction that's coming. If you're going to say, talk about the destruction, since I already mentioned England, I'll keep doing it. You could bring up London. That'd be the city we'd all think of first, right? But we'd also think of some other cities where we lived in Birmingham, or you might think of somewhere in Yorkshire, or you might think of any of the other cities, but London's going to be the first place. And so we could quickly just say, if he's talking about the destruction of London, then probably we're thinking that all England has fallen, that kind of thing. So you see, the Bible loves to do stuff like that. So Edom, Esau, Teman, they're all referring to the judgment that's coming on the Edomites. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob. So still, God expects that the Edomites would recognize their historical relationship and say, you're supposed to be giving preference to Israel, or in this case to Judah, the southern kingdom. But you turn against them and act like you don't know them. You've mistreated your brother, he says. And then he describes what they did. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth. So again, this is a prophet speaking. He's speaking of something that hasn't happened yet, but is going to, and what Edom is going to do when it happens. And so when the Babylonians come through and they strip Judah of its wealth, and they take away its prominent people, and they kill so many others, what is Edom going to do? Stand aloof and watch these Gentiles come in and loot the temple and loot and take off everything. It says, in fact, you were like one of them. You were gloating so much in this and enjoying it so much, you participated in it. You were as bad as the invaders, he says. And says you shouldn't. Now look at the different ways he describes the way Edom responded to the Babylonians coming in. Or that they will respond, I should say. Don't gloat over your brother and his misfortune. Don't rejoice over the people of Judah and their destruction. Don't boast in their trouble. Don't march through the gates. And remember, they're close by. You could see that some of the Edomites, when they see that Jerusalem has fallen, just trek on up there to Jerusalem and walk through and kind of laugh at the fact that these people have fallen. Don't gloat over them in their calamity. Don't seize their wealth, going and looting the city and looting all of Judah. You shouldn't wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives. So remember, people are fleeing and people are trying to get out of harm's way. And what do? You don't help. In fact, you attack. You see that this is the time when they're vulnerable, so we'll kill their people. That's what he says. Or you don't hand over their survivors. And so you take some people prisoner just to turn them over to the Babylonians, that kind of thing. This is exactly why God says, look, when I was serious, when I told Abraham that I'm going to make you a great nation, and those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse, I meant that. And so they thought it was funny to watch Judah fall, the southern kingdom. But God is going to judge them for it. Verse 15, the day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they'd never been. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. Jacob will be a fire, and Joseph a flame. Esau will be stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. There will be no survivors from Esau. The Lord has spoken. So, more about the day of the Lord. Usually, the day of the Lord is described in a very ominous way, as a way when calamity falls on God's enemies. Now, it's not always that way. One of the great things about the New Testament is it takes this concept of the day of the Lord and weds it to the idea of the Messiah coming and rescuing his people and bringing together Jew and Gentile. So the day of the Lord isn't simply bad news, but the question is, which side of it are you going to be on? Here, the Edomites, he says, because they betrayed God's people, it's going to be bad for them. And he says, the day of the Lord is near for all nations, for all the Gentiles, including Edom. And then he rehearses something that you might call, the golden rule, like the backwards golden rule. So what the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I said the backwards one or the reverse one, maybe bizarro golden rule, you could say. As you have done, it will be done to you. So you thought it was funny to watch Israel fall or to watch Judah fall? It will also happen to you. Your deeds will return on your own head. So it's also going to happen to you. You're going to be betrayed by your allies. You're going to watch your own cities fall. Verse 16 is a little bit of a puzzle. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. The way it's talking about the nations is that they're going to be judged. And so they're going to drink, and they're going to drink, and they're going to drink. It's like they've never drank before. In other words, they're going to drink God's judgment. So if that's the case, just as you drank on my holy hill, then it's saying just as Edom is going to be judged by God, so are the other nations. And God's not going to let up on his judgment. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. So this is one way to refer to Jerusalem. So even though Jerusalem is going to fall, and even though it's going to be really bad for a very long time, God's going to ultimately set up in Jerusalem his power again. And from Jerusalem, the world will be blessed. From Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy. Jacob will possess his inheritance. So Jacob is another way to refer to Israel, of course. So we uses a lot of the language of Jacob and Joseph, referring to Israel. He says they're going to be a fire, like a flame. They're going to be like the fire set to Esau. When that fire hits Esau, it's going to burn everything up. It'll just be a stubble left. It's going to be utterly destroy Esau. They'll set him on fire and destroy him. He says there will be no survivors from Esau. The Lord has spoken. Now, let me say this. Historically, it's not as if the Edomites went through and were destroyed and we never heard anything else about them. That's not how it worked out. Remember I said in the New Testament they're still around in different iterations in different places. But what does happen is this. They eventually disappear from history. Just like the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, how they were dispersed and then they're just gone. We don't know what happened to them. Same thing happens to Edom. And so they are utterly destroyed because their nation no longer existed and their identity no longer existed. So eventually, they're just left to the sands of history. That's God's judgment on them. I know you've heard David Young say before, one of the remarkable things about Israel is the fact that it exists today in 2022, knowing that some form of the very people we read about thousands of years ago is still alive today. When we read about all these other peoples that are gone, right? And I would suggest to you that's ultimately God's judgment. They're gone. Now, it is interesting that Egypt is still around, right? And remember, Egypt, people of Israel were told, look, be kind to the Egyptians. For a while you were simpatico. Not true that always you were, but the Egyptians, they get to hang around, but there are a lot of other places that we read about, and the Edomites are one of them. Where are they today? Swallowed up in human history. So that's what happens to Esau, what happens to Edom. Verse 19, people from the Negev will occupy the mountains of Esau, and people from the foothills will possess the land of the Philistines. They will occupy the fields of Ephraim and Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. The company of Israelite exiles who are in Canaan will possess the land as far as Zarephath. The exiles from Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the towns of the Negev. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. So this is how the book ends. And he mentions all these geographical places, some of which I know a little about, and some which we would have trouble identifying. But the Negev, we know where that is. And so there in the Sinai Peninsula, there is, I don't have a map for this, but there is this desert region, the Negev, north of the Sinai. And it is south there of Edom. Mentions the lands of the Philistines, so there's lands to the west. Ephraim and Samaria, so that's from the northern kingdom. Ephraim is another way to refer to Israel. Samaria, of course, was one of the chief cities in the northern kingdom. And in fact, it was the capital city. And then Benjamin, another way to refer to Judah, will possess Gilead. So Benjamin and Judah are the two southern tribes that form the Jews. And it says Benjamin will possess Gilead, which is on the other side of the Jordan. So these are all ways to say that the people of Israel are going to be reconstituted. And they're going to come from all these far-flung places because, when they're invaded, some of them are taken off, but a lot of them are dispersed. And so they're going to come from north, south, east, and west, and they're going to take back over this land. He says, all the way up in Zarephath, so even north towards Syria. Remember the story of the widow of Zarephath in the Gospels? Yeah, the point is that she is Gentile. She's from far away. And then he says even the exiles from Jerusalem who are in Sepharad. So Sepharad is the modern Hebrew word for Spain. But he's not referring to Spain here. Instead, in ancient times, it referred to Sardis, which is in western Turkey, which is still a long way away. So just a little bonus thing, if you've ever heard of Sephardic Jews, they are Jews who historically whose ancestors dwelt in Spain. Okay, so the Sepharad here is not talking about Spain. I don't know if anybody argues for that, but historically we know Sepharad was part of Turkey. So anyway, the point being, they're a long way away, but they're going to come, and this city, Jerusalem, is going to be established again. And so he says, deliverers, rescuers, we're going to come to Mount Zion, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. So the beauty of the message of the prophets is that it offers judgment, and lots of it, right? We've seen this over and over again, lots of judgment. But then glimpses of hope, too. And what the prophets couldn't see in the Old Testament times is the way that God was going to fulfill that hope. And what you need is the coming of Jesus for it all to come together, so that we see that it's always God's intention through his people Israel, to bless the world. What he means by that is something maybe different than it meant in the Old Testament, but based off of the seed of Israel, incorporating Gentiles from all over the world, God will bless this world. Now, some people believe literally in Jerusalem that God is going to establish a government one day. Some people in this church believe that. Maybe he will, okay? I'm not smart enough to say whether or not he will or he won't, but I am sure of this. Jesus and his kingdom is coming. In fact, Jesus and his kingdom are already here in some ways, right? God established his church to represent his kingdom here on earth. But the kingdom that he's ultimately promised, the kingdom will be the Lord's, and that's what we look forward to. Thanks so much for your attention. You are dismissed.